Greetings, my name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, or TPhGames as my little games channel here is called, and today we look into The Lord of the Rings Return to Moria. I had a live stream where I played round about 4 hours, then I started a new character to just try it again alone, this time a bit faster, and played a little bit further into the game. So I would say I have an okayish overview to give you my first impressions of the game. First of all, the good news. The game is not a complete disaster, unlike some previous installments, like for example the Gollum game, which I also reviewed here on this channel if you are interested. There's also a complete let's play of that on my Stream Archive channel. Further, I also have a second channel, my main channel, where I talk a lot about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings related writings and all the different versions that exist and go into the Tolkien lore, as I call it, in quite a bit of detail. So I'm very passionate about Tolkien, and every time I see Lord of the Rings in a name of some media piece, I definitely get excited and want to look into it. Same with Return to Moria. And as said, even though it's not a complete dumpster fire, it still has its problems and is definitely far from perfect. And we will look into this in this little first impressions video here. What I found very noticeable is that the game feels less like a full release and more like a very late version of early access. It definitely has some bugs, so I wouldn't say it's completely bugged like some other releases this year, but it's definitely noticeable that some minor things are a bit wonky here and there. For example, I noticed that some sounds in the game do not seem to play correctly or not at all. Sometimes the AI forgets what to do and doesn't seem that smart, to be honest. Further, I also read online, though I had this issue not yet myself because I have not unlocked fast travel yet, that if you fast travel from A to B, that it sometimes takes several minutes to load, which I guess is a bit excessive. And also the developers acknowledged this problem, and it seems like they will fix this as soon as possible. But you definitely notice that some polish is missing here and there in the game, which is a bit unfortunate, but it's not a complete disaster. Though if you keep in mind that this is now a full release, it is not early access, and it's like $40 or 40 euros, or your regional equivalent. And of course you can criticize it when the game is not at release where it should be when it comes to polish. And this often also generates the situation where the reviewer says maybe wait for a patch or two until those problems are ironed out. And some people might say it's a trend to release games in a terrible state and then fix them in the post-launch support with a lot of patches. But in my opinion, that is not a trend. This is kind of the standard we got used to that exists for, I would say, like almost or even over 2 decades. I remember quite a few games that came out in a terrible technical state in the distant past, but also in our present here. In 2005 there came out Battlefield 2, as I would call it, because it was so terrible on release. A lot of netcode issues, game crashes, some bugs that people could abuse and exploit to ruin the fun for others. It was not a great release and also needed quite a few patches. And this game had also a multiplayer focus, so it's even worse. And to be fair, the Battlefield series always had problems with their game releases, to be fair. I think maybe 2 or so were kind of okay, and these are AAA games. I think though often these not so great game launches are related to AA studios because they are sometimes newer studios that are very ambitious and also don't have that big of a budget. And you have to consider that a lack of polish in a video game is a resource issue. It's not an issue that the developers are not skilled enough to solve all those problems, but it is always they don't have the time for it, especially with classic bugs. Other stuff like problems in the game design are always kind of impossible to fix in many ways. Still in 2023, but maybe also in the recent past, we have seen multiple AAA games that came out that were not in a great technical state on launch. Think of Jedi Survivor this year, which in my opinion still takes the crown, or The Last of Us remaster that came out for PC this year that was also pretty terrible. I have to admit, the Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty expansion that came out recently, which I personally really like, but it also had quite a few annoying bugs and also performance issues at launch, which was very unfortunate to see. Further, we had some issues in Starfield and some other game releases this year. The list definitely goes on, and you wonder, why is that? I think there might be several reasons that lead to this maybe potential trend in the AAA sector. First of all, 2023, a lot of video games, especially AAA games, came out. So there were always some AAA games that had trouble at launch, and maybe because of the sheer quantity of games coming out this year, we might see more games failing as well this year. Further, I could also imagine that AAA game development definitely got more expensive, and maybe the resources that existed in the past for polish are now put elsewhere, and so the game come out less polished. Further, there might be also ambitions when it comes to bring some technical leaps here and there, and then they struggle kind of making it run smoothly on a lot of systems. Of course, there are also some positive examples, like Nintendo with their first-party games, maybe minus the Pokemon game, but that's, I think, a different beast. It's so impressive what they are doing. Like, think of the recently released Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which runs very smooth and is very polished, but especially Tears of the Kingdom. This is a game that is open world, physics-based. You can build stuff in it. You have like almost infinite combinations what you can do, and this is so tough to playtest and to QA. It is very impressive what Nintendo is doing there. So shoutouts to them for that. Of course, Nintendo has therefore other problems, I guess. So maybe see this as a little excursion into why some games might release in not a great technical state at times. Return to Moria now is in an okayish state, as said. It feels a bit like an early access game. There's some clunkiness here and there to it, which is a bit unfortunate, and it's a full release, so this can definitely be criticized. This is not an early access game where the developers can say, well, the game is not done yet, it gets better later. This is a full release, and they should have released the game, in my opinion, in a slightly better state. But it's okayish, especially, like I said, I'm personally more forgiving with smaller developers, and I know the issues and where they might come from. So it's okay. It's definitely tolerable, and by far not the worst release we have seen this year. Same goes with performance. It's okay. I also want to hint at that the game has DLSS 2, so the upscaling support. Also, AMD's FSR is supported. I did not see an option for Intel's XeSS. Not sure if that is implemented in case you run a card like that and might be in need of this option. I can't tell you. I also did not see a frame generation option, but I run a 3080, so I don't have access to frame generation anyway, so maybe it's just not shown there in the options. But I would assume it does only support DLSS 2 in case people wonder. However, if you look at the game, it is visually not that complex. Don't get me wrong, it's not an ugly game. I think it has a very nice and fitting art style for it, which I like quite a lot, but it's just dark tunnels with a little bit of rubble left and right and some cool dynamic light effects here and there and some particle effects. That's basically it. It's not as visual complex as, let's say, Cyberpunk on path tracing, or another game I revisited recently, which is Battlefield 2042. And interestingly, I thought about comparing the frame rates of these two games. And at the same resolution and same DLSS settings and comparable in-game settings, Battlefield 2042 has a higher frame rate than this game. And even though I don't need 200 frames per second in Return to Moria, I have definitely a decently powerful machine. If I now scale this down, maybe to somebody who wants to play this year on their laptop, then you could actually run into performance issues, which would be unfortunate. So for everyone who thinks about getting this game, definitely check online some benchmarks for Return to Moria with similar hardware to yours and see how it runs. Definitely check this out. Though I would expect it should run okayish, but don't expect a highly polished game that runs at 200 FPS on pretty much anything. The game itself is a co-op survival crafting game, I think you would call it, and that is in an interesting way its biggest weakness or problem, because this is a very oversaturated genre in my opinion. There are just so many games, and the very best of those are also better than this game, because they are out for a long time, they are very polished by now, they got tons of content upgrades and so on. You ask yourself the question, why would I play Return to Moria instead of those games? Just to give you an overview, there's Minecraft, there's 7 Days to Die, the fantastic and very big Terraria. We have Don't Starve, which I really liked with its unusual style. We have the fantastic Valheim. We also have the very cool, pun not intended, The Long Dark, Project Zomboid, Subnautica, which is also so great, Raft, which I really liked, Grounded. This War of Mine, though, this is kind of a special case because it goes in a completely different direction and is really thought-provoking, but it's a fantastic game. Rust, The Forest, or the new Sons of the Forest. We have Green Hell, Starbound, and even with its big redemption arc from release disaster to beloved game, No Man's Sky. And if we talk about those games, we could also include games like RimWorld, Factorio, Satisfactory. And in most of those games, you can easily put in hundreds, if not thousands of hours. And turns out these games are just very good at what they are doing. And on top of that, they are often also cheaper. Like, you can in some cases get multiple of those heavy hitters for the same price as Return to Moria. And if you now ask the question, why would I play this game instead of one of the others? Then the answer is at most because it has the Lord of the Rings license. That is kind of its selling point. And if you really like The Lord of the Rings, The Misty Mountains, Dwarves, Moria, then this game could be your gem because it's not bad. It's just that the competition is so strong and that the game also has 1 or 2 issues that might hold it back. Of course, it's also cool that John Rhys-Davies, the actor who played Gimli in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings adaptation, voices Gimli in this game again, which is pretty fantastic to be honest. Also, some lore details that we find in the game are pretty cool to discover. They definitely treat the Lord of the Rings universe with a lot of respect. Female dwarves can have beards and so on. But as I said, there are some elements in the game that hold it back. One is for sure, at least for me, combat. Combat is very basic in this game, and the enemy variety is also unfortunately not that big. So early in the game you have, like, let's say 5 different enemies that you fight over and over again. Then after an hour or 2 you get a new enemy type introduced that maybe is a bit different compared to the previous ones, or in some cases is pretty much the same. It's now just an enemy that takes more hits and also does more damage. That's basically the difference. But your approach fighting this enemy stays completely the same to what you have done before. And then of course enemies can spawn around you and so on, and maybe you are exploring or trying to build something and then you get disturbed in this, and that just gets annoying. Considering how basic and repetitive combat is, it's kind of surprising that it happens so often in the game, because that's definitely not the strongest part in the game, and unfortunately it's very present and for me often in the way of doing things that I enjoy doing more in the game. And that's of course not a great feeling, especially if the game forces you to fight a lot. Your base can get raided, there's like a story moment where suddenly a huge horde comes in and fights you, and alone it's an absolute nightmare. I read that if you play with a lot of players, the combat becomes far too easy, because then there you don't have enough enemies in many situations. And this is kind of how they try to challenge the player. They just increase the numbers, the quantity instead of the quality of the enemies. And so you have to fight 20 orcs and it's just a slog to fight them. It's in a way not that difficult, but you have to fight very slow and careful, and this makes it even more repetitive and a slog. Simply not that fun. If we look further into the other elements of the game wants to tell you a story. As a result, it has to sacrifice freedoms. This is not a sandbox experience, it is more a linear experience. And as a result, you can, for example, not dig holes in every wall and mine freely through the world, because it would kind of circumvent this design or kind of be in the way of what the game tries to achieve. And I can kind of understand this, but this again makes then this element also less interesting and exploring not so interesting. That's definitely also a downside of this. Further, when it comes to base building, which is often also a very important part for a lot of people, the game is also not that free. Of course, you can build your base anywhere you want, but the designers and developers of this game definitely had some places for this in mind and made those very attractive. And as a result, finding a very cool spot for your base, exploring the world and so on, is not really a big part of this game. It's not possible to kind of make this. And then when you build a new base somewhere, you maybe notice if you try to build more complex stuff that suddenly a wall collapses for no apparent reason, because there may be some bugs or some rules that the game does not really tell you. And then you wonder, okay, why is that not possible? And you feel like, okay, I can't build my mighty dwarven fortress in Moria to show the orcs what dwarves are capable of. That seems not the way. You also can't build very creative traps for orcs or for enemies like you would do in Minecraft or something. The game is simply not designed to give you this amount of freedom, it seems. Be that creative. And if you have played those other games, you also kind of know what you are missing and know what's possible in those and how stuff could have been better, and then you might find this game a little bit lacking in that regard. Though as said, it's not bad, it's just in many ways a little bit too basic and, in my opinion or for my taste, missing a bit of freedom here and there. And from this perspective, it is very hard to say if they might be able to expand from here to maybe solve these particular issues, because the game is designed as a more linear experience, and this is of course limiting the freedom quite a bit. On the other hand, this might be exactly what some players want, a more linear experience that they can enjoy with their friends. And I would recommend to play this game actually with 1 or 2 friends at least, because this makes basically every video game better. Like, what video game it does not get better playing with your friends? There are maybe very few exceptions to this. And even I had a good time playing this game for the most part. There were definitely some parts I found a little bit annoying, but that is very often the case, to be honest. Interestingly, in the discussion around this game, some people bring the argument that it's also not a AAA game. And that is of course true, even though it has a very big license. But if we look into the best games I mentioned earlier in this genre, what game there is a AAA game? Actually, maybe Grounded and Sons of the Forest, but all other games are also AA and very often actual indie games made by very, very small development teams. Like, look at the release version of Minecraft that was developed by like a handful of people. That is not a AAA game. It had AAA success for sure, but it was never a AAA game in its origin. So this can't be an excuse for any issues that Return to Moria might have. So in conclusion, maybe wait a patch or 2 until things are ironed out here, and maybe also performance gets hopefully a little bit better so that people don't have issues, especially the fast travel loading times should get reduced. That is, I think, very important. The game is definitely for people who like Lord of the Rings and want to dive in this specific scenario as a dwarf in Moria in the 4th Age after the War of the Ring and the destruction of the One Ring. So if you find this interesting, maybe check this out, but don't expect the next big revolution in the survival crafting genre. This of course brings us now to the end of the video. I hope you found this remotely useful in any shape or form. If so, maybe leave a comment and press the like button. Would be much appreciated. Are you interested in the game? Have you played it already? If so, what were your impressions so far? How does the late game hold up? How does the base building work out later? That I would be very interested if you have found this out already. Further, also subscribe. That would be especially appreciated because I still want to hit these 1000 subscribers soon. Further, shoutouts to all people supporting me. That is really much appreciated. Thank you, and I would say see you people next time. Goodbye.